Okay, everybody, thank you for coming. And tonight's shir is dedicated a refuah shlema of Nata ben Zisel and a shir Nechama Tova ben David. A shir Nechama Tova Bas David?
Oh no, sorry, it was Bat Sarah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bat Sarah, A shir Nechama Tova Bat Sarah. And for all those whose health has been affected by the war, and especially for the safe and quick return of our brothers and sisters held in captivity, and Hatzlacha of the IDF, and unity of Am Yisrael, Aliyat Neshama for Yitzchak Hirsch ben Eliezer, and for the whole month of Adar Sheni, Rena and Mark Questel are sponsoring the lecture in honor of Rabbi Breitowitz. Thank you for a speedy victory in Gaza and a safe return of all of our chayolim and all of our hostages. Again, an anonymous donation for the safe return of the army and the hostages to their homes in total health, the nitzachon of the Jewish nation, and the coming of Mashiach. And finally, Yiboneh wants to thank all of those who have contributed towards the purchase of a Sefer Torah. We are closing in on 60% of our goal. We are still looking for partners to help complete payment for this Torah scroll, to commemorate the memory of a loved one, or to participate in sharing your love for Torah. Donations can be made either on the website or by link on the YouTube description. Again, as I've said a few times already, this Torah will be used, hopefully, Be'ezras Hashem, for a weekday learners minyan. This is a need that really is unmet in Yerushalayim, and this would be a way in which you're not just contributing to a Torah scroll, but you're also facilitating the spread of Torah and teaching people about tefillah. I also want to add that the 2nd of Adar, the day that just passes my mother's yahrzeit, so although it's already a little late, I would also like to dedicate the shir Le'iloi Nishmat Imi Marasi Chaya Esther Bas Eliezer. Should be an Aliyas Neshama. Okay, so we are in the month of Adar Sheni. Mishenichnas Adar Marbin B'Simcha applied, of course, even to the first Adar, but the second Adar even more so. So Be'ezras Hashem, we hope that this month will be a Yeshua and a Geula for Am Yisrael. It's amazing how things don't change. Thousands of years ago, in the month of Adar, we were in grave sakana because of an enemy that wanted to destroy us, coming from Persia, Amalek, but in Persia. And today, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah, they're basically funded by Iran, which is Persia. So we still have enemies in Persia or from Persia trying to destroy us. And of course, we hope that Purim too will be v'napochu. Things will be upside down, things will be reversed, that those who try to destroy the Jewish people themselves get destroyed. So there are really two different things I want to talk about. One is kind of a concluding thought on the Parsha, and then I want to talk a little bit about Purim. Mr. Hashem, we'll still have one more session before Purim, but I'll talk a little bit about Purim even today. The first thing I want to talk about is really more of a general idea about the Luchos Shnios, because remember that Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the first tablets, and Moshe Rabbeinu smashed them, and then he prayed for Am Yisrael, and the second time he went up on Rosh Chodesh Elul for a second 40 days. It was actually the third 40-day period, because the middle was a 40 days of prayer and the like. But the last time he went up to get the Torah, he came down with the Luchos Shnios, and that was on Yom Kippur. So we don't always think about it this way, but remember, we think about Shavuos as the day that we got the Torah. So let's think about that for a moment. What happened on Shavuos? We have a whole share about that, but even without getting into all of the subtleties, we didn't get the whole Torah on Shavuos. That's very, very clear. Shavuos, at most, if even this, was the day we heard the Aseres Hadibros. We heard God give us the 10 Commandments, and according to many views, we only heard the first 2 commandments. Moshe Rabbeinu did not come down with Luchos until 40 days after that point. So he came down with Luchos on the 17th of Tammuz. He saw the Chet HaEgel. He smashed the luchos. And the last time he went up was Rosh Chodesh Elul. And for the 40 days between Rosh Chodesh Elul and Yom Kippur, God gave him the Torah again. And he came down on Yom Kippur. So the truth of the matter is, Yom Kippur is the actual day when we received the Luchos Habris, the tablets of the covenant. In fact, it's even a little strange why we celebrate Matan Torah on Shavuos. Because what we were given on Shavuos was actually broken and smashed. It is what we were given on Yom Kippur that endures and lasts. The Luchos are the Luchos Shnios. Now granted, Chazal do say that in the Aron HaKodesh, in the Mishkan, there were the second Luchos that were intact, and there were the fragments of the first Luchos. Quite amazing. Luchos, the Shivrei Luchos, Munachos B'Aron. In the Aron HaKodesh were both the second Luchos that were intact and the pieces of the first Luchos. And the Gemara has a beautiful drasha. From here we see that if an elderly person, through illness or dementia, has forgotten their Torah learning, you must still honor them. You must give them homage for the person that they were, and spiritually the person they still are, because even the broken luchos are given honor in the Aron HaKodesh. But be it as it may, we often don't associate Yom Kippur with the day of getting the Torah, getting the luchos shnios. In fact, it's interesting, Purim itself, there's a famous word from the Arizal. I'm sure you've heard it. That, Yom Kippur in the Torah is called Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonements, plural. Day of Forgiveness is in plural. And in Pshat, it's called Kippurim because it's a kapara both for the people who are alive and the people who have died. This is why we say Yizkor on Yom Kippur, for an atonement for the dead. But the Arizal has a drasha that Yom Kippurim means a day like Purim. Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. That implies Purim is even greater than Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is almost like Purim. Now, if you had to pick 2 days that are the most dissimilar, you would say, well, Yom Kippur and Purim are like the 2 very, very different days of the year. One is solemn, one is you're fasting, you're davening all day. Purim is full of externalized rejoicing. And yet the simple idea is that Yom Kippur is not only a day of atonement, it is a day of Matan Torah, a day of receiving the Torah. Purim is also a day of receiving the Torah, because it is said that at Mount Sinai, God held a mountain over our heads, and we were forced into it. If you accept the Torah, that's good. If not, I'm going to squish you like a pancake. So we accepted the Torah out of fear. On Purim, in gratitude to God, we accepted the Torah out of love. So this is a simple pshat of the Arizal. The reason why Yom Kippur is a day like Purim, but not as great as Purim, is Yom Kippur represents accepting the Torah out of fear, because it is a continuation of the Shavuos experience, where God held a mountain over our heads. Purim is accepting the Torah out of love, and since Ava, love, is a greater level than simple fear, that is why Purim has a certain element of holiness even beyond Yom Kippur, right? So these are the Luchos Shnios. Now, when you compare the first Luchos and the second Luchos, the first Luchos were broken and the second Luchos were not, you do find a very, very interesting thing. The first Luchos, God in both of them, he engraved the words. The words of the 10 Commandments are engraved on the first Luchos, or were engraved on the first Luchos, and those letters flew away, right? According to many Midrashim, Moshe did not break the Luchos, but the letters flew away, and the Luchos became too heavy. And God engraved the letters on the second Luchos as well. But the difference was, who cut the tablets from the stone? In the first Luchos, God gave Moshe the tablets. The second Luchos Moshe was commanded, B'solecha, you should cut the tablets, and I will write, B'kasavti, I will write. So just make a note of that, because it'll become very important. The first luchos were cut, so to speak, by God. The second luchos were cut by Moshe and were then inscribed by God. So the inscription was by God in both cases. But the cutting, the excavating of the stone was by Hashem the first time and by Moshe the second time. Another point. When Moshe came down the second time, Yom Kippur, it's the third time because there was an intermediary prayer stage, but the second time with Torah, Moshe's face was shining. The light of the Shekhinah was in his face. Ad kedei kach that people could not look at him. They could not look at him because, in effect, it was the countenance of the divine light. And Moshe had to cover himself. Moshe had to wear a hood over his face. And when he spoke and he gave mitzvos, he would uncover and Klal Yisrael would look down, but they would be facing Moshe. Other than that, he had to walk with his head covered. Why was this true only after the second luchos? This was not true until that point. When he came down on Shivas Arba Tammuz and broke the luchos, he was still involved with the people. I mean, Moshe was involved in the punishments for the Chedo Egel and everything else. And we don't find that Moshe had to cover his face. So we see already two basic differences between the Luchos Rishonos and the Luchos Achronos. Difference number one, who cut the Luchos? The Luchos Rishonos are Hashem. The Luchos Shenios are Moshe. Difference number two, Ki Karan or Panav, the shining of Moshe's countenance, only appears by the Luchos Shenios, the second Luchos. It does not appear by the Luchos Rishonos. By the way, I'm sure you've heard over the years that the phrase in the pasuk that Moshe's face was radiant with light uses the term ki karan or panav. His face was shining with beams of light. Now, karan is connected to horn. It was like horns of light. But this was the basis of the well-known belief that many people had that Jews have horns. It's an old anti-Semitic belief, but indeed, in Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses, a very famous statue, there are these horns coming out of Moshe's head, and that comes from the mistranslation or the misunderstanding of the word kikaran or panav, which means it was shining with beams of light. They interpreted there were horns. Now, why would there be horns? Why Michelangelo thought that, who knows? But that is the southern, I don't want to stigmatize a whole region of the United States, but many southerners had the belief that that was the meaning of the kippah. Why are you wearing that kippah? Because under the kippah, who knows what's over there. Some horns are sticking out, and that's why Jews always had to keep their heads covered in that way. But we just want to focus a little bit on the notion of these two differences between the first luchos and the second luchos. Now, there is a medrash that says the following. The medrash says, from where did Moshe get the divine light that shone from his face? Called the Karnei HaHod. Where did Moshe get the Karnei HaHod? So listen to the medrash. The medrash says that from the quill pen that Moshe had in Shemayim, the pen, there was a little leftover ink in the pen. And Moshe's radiance came from the leftover ink in the quill pen. That's what the medrash says. That the Karnei HaHod comes from the Shiurei Dio, the leftover ink in the kulmas, in the pen. So once again, this is a medrash that's very enigmatic. What ink? Moshe Rabbeinu was not writing with ink. In fact, Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't writing at all. I mean, the luchos were engraved in stone by God. There was no pen. There was no ink. And anyway, how does leftover ink give you light? What's the shaychus? What's the connection between leftover ink and divine rays of glory? And what leftover ink did Moshe Rabbeinu have? So there's a very, very famous drasha from the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi is the founder of the Brisker dynasty, more or less. He was the first Soloveitchik to be the Rav of Brisk. This is Rav Yosef Dober Halevi. He didn't necessarily have the Brisker derech of learning. The Brisker derech of learning was kind of invented by his son Rav Chaim. And then Rav Chaim's son was the last Rav of Brisk before the Holocaust, who came to Eretz Yisrael, the Brisker Rav, and all of the Brisker yeshivos come from his children and grandchildren and the like. So the Beis Halevi may not actually qualify to be a Brisker, but he's quite literally grandfathered in, meaning to say the Beis Halevi is an honorary Brisker because he founded the derech. He was one of the great Gedolei Hador, and he wrote a masterful book of Shelos Teshuvos, of Responsa, but in the book there's a chelek that's devoted to inyanim of drush, of drasha, and biblical interpretation. That's in addition to another little sefer he has on Bereshis and Shmos, called Beis Halevi. But in the Shelos Teshuvos itself, there's really a treasure of beautiful, beautiful drashas. A lot of people don't notice it necessarily. And the Beis Halevi goes on this medrash. What does it mean that Moshe Rabbeinu was zocheh to the karnei hahod, to the rays of glory, because of the leftover ink in the kulmas, in the pen? So he says the following. He actually brings an amazing Talmud Yerushalmi in Maseches Shkalim that says that the first luchos did have the Ten Commandments, of course, but it had much, much more than the Ten Commandments. In between each commandment were all of the interpretations of all of the mitzvos and all of the Torah Shebal Peh, all of the things that later would become part of the oral law. Initially, they were explicit in the luchos itself. In other words, had we gotten that first luchos, there wouldn't have been a concept of a written Torah and an oral Torah that's transmitted. It all would have been explicit and beferish. The luchos rishonos, again, miraculously, how could you put everything on those luchos? But everything was on the first luchos. The luchos rishonos would have given us every possible understanding and interpretation of the whole Torah. God would have given it to us. There wouldn't have been a need, number one, for an oral transmission, and there wouldn't have been a need for interpretation. Right? We have, one of the big questions everybody asks is that if God gave Moshe both the written Torah and an oral interpretation, then how could there be so many arguments? Right? Every page of Gemara is filled with arguments. One person says kosher, one person says treif, one person says pure, one person says impure. Well, if God gave Moses everything, then God told Moshe one thing or the other. How could there be arguments? Meaning, how can you maintain the idea that all of this comes from God and at the same time maintain the possibility of mutually exclusive opinions? But the simple understanding is that God gave Moshe foundational principles, and then the Chachamim debate and argue how to apply those principles. So yes, there can be machlokes, because even if people are in possession of the same principles, they could differ how to apply them. So one thing you need to understand about the oral law is the oral law is not just about mechanical transmission of information from here to there, to there, to there, to there. It is also about creativity. It is also about application. It is also about figuring out how to take pre-existing principles and apply them to new situations. In other words, the oral law is creative, dynamic, innovative. It is not simply transmission. See, a lot of people in yeshiva, they learn that every single word of what we call the oral law that was eventually written down was given by Hashem to Moshe. In other words, Moshe was given a verbatim transcript of the Babylonian Talmud. What about the Jerusalem Talmud? What about the Yerushalmi? I remember hearing a boy say, again, he went well-meaning because he was a sincerely religious boy. He said he believed Bi'amuna Shalema that every word of the Mishnah Brura, which the Chafetz Chaim authored in the 1880s, was transmitted from Hashem to Moshe orally for 2,000 years until the Chafetz Chaim saw that people would forget it, so the Chafetz Chaim wrote it down. Again, I don't mean to make fun of a person who was very sincere, but that is, as a position, that's an idiotic position. The Chafetz Chaim wasn't sitting trying to listen to some voice that was telling him what should be the next word that he should write on the paper. The Mishnah Brura are the Chafetz Chaim's own words. In other words, what the point I'm making is, the notion of the oral law is not just from one generation to another, we're simply handing down material. Rather, there are principles that were handed down, but we have to apply them in every generation, and that's why there's a machlokas. But says the Beis Halevi, based on this Talmud Yerushalmi, that was a consequence of the sin of the golden calf, in which we no longer had it in the Luchos. The second Luchos only had the 10 Commandments. And as a result, when the Torah was eventually given, some of it was written down, and everything else had to be transmitted, and that's why there's ambiguity, and that's why there's confusion, and that's why there's machlokas about how to apply it. Because we no longer had the clarity that we would have had for the first Luchos. The first Luchos, God would give you the answer to everything. The second Luchos, God says, I'm giving you the basic material. You have to figure out how to apply this material. And that is the chidush, the innovation of Torah Shebaal Peh. So the Beis Halevi says, the whole concept that some of the Torah is in writing and some of the Torah is Baal Peh. Some of the Torah is explicit from Hashem. Other parts of the Torah we have to apply these principles. And therefore there'll be uncertainty, confusion, machlokas. All of this is the chiddush of the second Luchos. This is the post-Chet HaEgel Torah that God gives us. The pre-Chet HaEgel, version 1, everything would have been explicit. So, this is the meaning of the idea that the first Luchos, God cut the stone and inscribed them. The second Luchos is a partnership situation. Moshe cuts the stone, God inscribes. Because once we have Torah Shebaal Peh, Torah now becomes not simply a directive of God, but it becomes a collaboration. It becomes a partnership between God and Bnei Yisrael. And that's even reflected in the division of responsibility. God inscribes the letters, but Moshe Rabbeinu had to cut the stone. Now, the Pashtus, the way we would understand this, is that this is a consequence of sin. Because we sinned, we no longer deserved the clarity and explicitness of the Luchos Rishonos. Again, it's very parallel to the Garden of Eden. Many Midrashim, many Chazals describe Matan Torah as a return to the Garden of Eden. We were given immortality. Adam and Chava were supposed to live forever. Because of the Chet, they lost that. They were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Many Meforshim say, based on Chazal, that at Matan Torah we regained immortality. We're back in Eden. And once again, we get expelled because of the Chet HaEgel. Now, in the aftermath of the sin of the Eitz Hadas, there was a curse. You must eat your bread by the sweat of your brow. Meaning, God is the source of your parnasa, but you're going to have to work for it. Look at the exact parallel. Originally, God gave us a Torah in which He gave us the answer to everything. Now, after the Chet HaEgel, we get re-expelled from the Garden of Eden. We got to work for it. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. Bread is also a reference to the wisdom of the Torah. That's like the bread of nutrition. You see, it's an exact parallel on a spiritual level. The curse of Zeyat HaPecha Toch HaLechem is what you would call the curse of Torah Shebaal Peh. So the simple understanding is that this is a yerida, this is a downfall, this is an expulsion from Gan Eden, this is a curse. But in reality, the Beis Halevi says, it also represents a tremendous elevation of level. Because remember, I mentioned last week the Ramban or 2 weeks ago, the Ramban and the Kuzari, who actually explain that the sin of the golden calf was not a sin of idolatry, it was not a sin of Avodah Zarah, but rather it was a sin in the Jewish people believing that without an intermediary of Moshe Rabbeinu, they were not worthy of a relationship with God. The Chet HaEgel was not so much a sin against the Almighty as it was not having faith in their capacity to have a relationship with Hashem. So now you understand that what God is doing is, God is reassuring Am Yisrael that they are partners with God in the creation of Torah. That instead of God from above just giving us all the answers, Hashem says we are in a partnership relationship. So on one hand, you can look at the change between the first Luchos and the second Luchos as a consequence of sin and an expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Yeah, for sure. But you can also look at it as God reassuring Am Yisrael that they are his partners in Torah. And again, to repeat again, forgive me for emphasizing this, the idea of the oral law is not mechanical transmission. There is creativity, there is dynamism, there is autonomy, there is taking the raw material of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and applying it to new situations. That's a promotion, says the Beis Halevi, not a demotion. Hashem is saying, you're my shutaf. The greatness of Torah Shebaal Peh is we become partners with Hashem as opposed to being passive recipients of divine truth. The Luchos Rishonos, we would be passive. God simply gives us the answer to everything. Luchos Shnios, we work. We have to figure it out. We have to apply it. And this, in a sense, is Hashem's nechama, comfort to us, in the aftermath of the Chet HaEgel. So now the Beis Halevi says very beautifully, this is the meaning of the Medrash, the leftover ink. It's poetic. Midrashim speak in poetic language. The leftover ink is simply a metaphor for the part of the Torah that would no longer be written down and explicit. Meaning, where did Moshe get the divine radiance? From the fact that from now on, he, and henceforth other human beings, are going to be actually creators of Hashem's Torah. And that gives you the divine light, because that gives you the godlike capacity to be a co-partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the creation of Torah. So it's poetic. In fact, this is very important. I mean, this itself, there's a side point. The Beis Halevi is not talking about how to approach Agadata generally. But you see from this word a very big yesod in Medrash and Agada, that it does speak in poetic ways, meaning to say, the Medrash does not mean literally, Moshe had a quill pen and there was leftover ink. It's a metaphorical description of the fact that in the second Luchos, a lot of the Torah was not going to be communicated explicitly, and it would be handed down, and that gave Moshe the Karnei HaHod, and the Beis Halevi goes on and says that every Jew that is involved in learning the Torah Shebaal Peh and in struggling to apply it to life gets that divine radiance. They become like a Sefer Torah. They become like a Sefer Torah because the Torah of Hashem is now in their heart and in their soul and not simply on the parchment. So Torah is not simply what we obey, but it's also what we create. Torah Sheba'al Peh is what we create in the world. And therefore we become a Sefer Torah. And that's the Karnei HaHoid of Moshe Rabbeinu, that divine partnership. So this is again, the beautiful drasha of the Beis Halevi explaining the Medrash that the Karnei HaHod, the radiant beams of light, come b'dafka from the fact that there's a Torah Sheba'al Peh. In fact, the Beis Halevi even says a very big chiddush. He says the famous statement that when Moshe Rabbeinu brings the first luchos down, he didn't smash them intentionally, but the letters flew away. So the Beis Halevi wants to be medayek. This is not how most people learn. It doesn't mean the Ten Commandments flew away. It meant all of the intervening commentary flew away, leaving him only with the written Ten Commandments. And then it becomes too heavy and too unbearable. Without the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which at that time was not Ba'al Peh, at that time it was in the Luchos, you can't bear it. The Torah is unbearable. It's impossible to understand. So that's his chiddush. His chiddush is the letters that flew away was what became later the Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's the Beis Halevi's chiddush. You know, it reminds me, this metaphorical interpretation of the ink, which is really very, very nice. It's a poetic way of expressing the omitted part of the Torah. It reminds me of, again, Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz once gave a mashal, the way Midrashim talk. How do you, if you want to understand Midrashic language, you have to understand it in a non-literal way. He said, imagine, in 19th century Russia, Tsarist Russia, Jews were confined to designated areas where they could live. They could not live in most places unless they got special permits that were difficult. And they were confined to an area that was called the Pale of Settlement. Now, Jews had to live in the Pale of Settlement. That's where the shtetlich, that's where the villages were located. Now, because the Russians in the 19th century liked to play games, so the boundaries of the Pale would often switch all the time. And you'd get a notice that says, in 2 weeks, you have to move 20 kilometers north of here. So people often had to move and relocate and the like. So imagine Rabbi Yitzchak said that 100,000 Jews were ordered to relocate in 48 hours. And imagine a journalist wrote a story that said the following, and this is the headline of the story. With a drop of ink, the Tsar drowned 100,000 people. And let's imagine that 100 years later, you find a yellowed newspaper that says, with a drop of ink, 100,000 people were drowned. And you'd read that headline, and you would say, that is so ridiculous. What do you mean 100,000 people drowned by a drop of ink? Was the Tsar a giant? Were the people a midget? A drop of ink could drown 100,000 people? It makes no sense. But says Rabbi Yitzchak, if you understood the historical background, you would see it is a poetic way of expressing that by the Tsar signing this decree, 100,000 people's lives were ruined. So Rabbi Yitzchak said, Midrashim often talk that way. When Midrashim say things that are outlandish, that are far-fetched, that couldn't happen at all, there are different approaches. Some people say everything Chazal say has to be understood. Esther had a tail. Everything is literal, literal, literal. But the emes is, it's lav dafka. In fact, the Rambam himself writes that people make a common binary mistake in Midrashim. People typically will ask the question, is a Medrash true or is a Medrash not true? And the Rambam says, there were two schools of thought. There are good, well-meaning, believing people that say every single thing in the Medrash is true. I don't care if Moshe was 20 amos, Moshe was 40 feet high, so be it. Right? Those are well-meaning people. And then there are people that say, these are Baba Mises, these are stories, these are made-up things, these are superstitions. So the Rambam says the following. These are two groups of people. One group are well-meaning fools, And the other group are heretics and apikoursim. And the Rambam says this is the wrong question to ask. Don't ask, are midrashim true or false? Midrashim are 100% true. But truth is not always literal. Chazal are conveying spiritual ideas through parable, through allegory, through very colorful language. That doesn't take away from their truth. Of course there's fundamental truths. What are these midrashim trying to teach me? And those are the truths of Torah. But the truths of Torah, at least when Chazal express them, are not meant to be literal or physical constructs of reality. What happened in a physical way is actually less important than the spiritual lesson that is being conveyed. This is a very important yesod in Midrashim, because it reminds me not to have an either-or choice, not to say it's either true or false. The answer is it's true, but true is lav dafka, literal, factual truth. In fact, literal, factual truth is actually less important than spiritual truth. Literal truth, you go on social media, you could see what somebody ate for breakfast today. Today I had this, today I had hot sauce on my eggs as opposed to soy sauce or whatever it is. That's facts. Facts are infinite. This, that. It can add up to a pile of junk. Spiritual truths are enduring pathways of life. And they could be expressed in vivid stories, in metaphors, in mishalim. It's a way of getting the audience excited, so to speak, among other things. It's also a way, the Gra says, of concealing the truths to those who are not ready to receive them. So there was actually, it's interesting, the idea of parable is a double-edged sword. It was a way of making a lesson very vivid. It was also a way of concealing the lesson, right, from those who were not yet ready to receive it. So it had a double contradictory function. Actually, it was a contradiction. A way of communication and a way of covering up communication at the same time. So it's interesting that although the Beis Halevi's drasha is not devoted to Medrash in general, but to me, actually is a very, very excellent example of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's point, the Rambam's point, much earlier, and the like, that midrashim are not meant always to be taken literal. Now, by the way, I don't mean to say this is true about all midrashim. It is very, very clear that there's a certain percentage of midrashim where Chazal had actual traditions about things that happened. Meaning, there is a historical aspect to many midrashim, but there's also an allegorical aspect at the same time. The big question for every student is, so how do I know? How do I know what is meant to be taken literally and what is an allegory or a metaphor? Well, the truth is, we're kind of in trouble. The Rambam writes in the Hakdama to the Parish of Mishnayos, when he discusses Agada, that he is going to write a book, he is going to write a SEFER that will go through Midrashim and Agada, and he will indicate the criteria by when do you say it's literal and historical, and when do you say it's allegorical and a metaphor, and he will explain the basis of it. What a book that would have been. Unfortunately, either the book got lost or probably the Rambam never got around. He couldn't do everything, even the Rambam. The Rambam never got around to writing it, so it's one of the tragic books that the Rambam promised that we were not able to get. So we don't have a definitive answer. And yet, those of you study some of the great commentaries on Agada, like Maharal, you will basically see that the Maharal essentially uses the symbolic approach to almost most of the Agados, in the Talmud at least, and many Midrashim as well, in which the Maharal does uncover symbolic meaning. So he is considered to be the great expositor, one of the great, maybe the greatest expositor of the symbolic language of Agada. And once again, I'm going to say something that may sound harsh and even apicorsis, but that is, the word myth in English is a misunderstood word, actually. When we say something is a myth, we usually say that in a negative way. It's pejorative, it's negative, it's fake, it's false. But in, sociology, myth is a very different thing. A myth is a vehicle by which very powerful ideas are communicated through the non-literal medium of stories. Whether it's Greek mythology, of course the ideas could be traced, but basically mythology was a way of conveying very important ideas to a society. Now again, the society might be degenerate, it might be totally wrong, that's a separate thing, but myth is the vehicle to communicate ideas and philosophies of life. In that way, myths are actually more truthful than the trivia of everyday life. So, if I make a statement, midrashim are largely myths. You hear that statement, you're going to throw stones at me. You're going to, maybe they'll do it anyway. What apikoros? But if you understand by myth, we mean the conveying of fundamental spiritual ideas through the medium of mashal and parable, then yeah, that's exactly the case. Midrashim are the myths of Am Yisrael that communicate the deepest spiritual ideas. Okay, so I digressed a little bit, but I thought that from this Beis HaLevi, we actually see a very good example of that idea. Okay, so that's kind of part one. I just wanted to share the Beis HaLevi's beautiful, beautiful drasha on the nature of the oral law and the fact that you become a co-creator with God. I think I've mentioned before a mashal to baking a cake. Let's assume that you have a 4-year-old child and you want to get a cake for the child's birthday. So there are different things you can do. The easiest thing is to buy a nice cake in the bakery. That's pretty easy. The next best is you make the cake yourself when your kid is asleep or in gan. So that's a little harder, but you make the cake yourself, but you can do it. But then there's a much higher level where you want to involve your child in making the cake. I want to make the cake with my 4-year-old. Now, making a cake with a 4-year-old can be a big challenge. There could be flour on the floor and sugar on the counter and cocoa all over the place and eggshells, and the cake could be lumpy and underbaked in one part of the pan and overbaked in the other part of the pan. If you were interested, if the only agenda you had was to make the best possible cake that you could, you would be well advised not to do it with your 4-year-old. You could do a better job yourself or go to a bakery. And yet, the love that is expressed by the interaction and by the relationship is much more important than the perfection of the cake. Torah Shabbat Peh is exactly the same way. The oral law is so filled with argument, with disagreement, with different perspectives. I mean, listen, if we wouldn't have this, yeshivas would close down, right? People are arguing the whole day about this and that, and looking at it this way, looking at it that way. I think it's not irreverent to say that Talmudic learning is very messy. It's messy. It would have been neater. It would have been simpler. It would have been more straightforward if God would simply give you the answer to every question. God could have made the cake and it would have been perfect. But Hashem says He wants to make the cake with us. And therefore He'll give us the principles. We kind of have to figure out how to apply them. Messy, ambiguous, confusing, lack of clarity. But that's the highest depth of the relationship, that we are co-creators of Torah Hashem with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is the radiant light that comes from the face of a person who is part of that process of Torah. And I just want to emphasize that this is not only the province of the great, great, great Gedolim, but every Jew that engages with trying to figure things out is kind of a partner with God in trying to bring out of the Torah the truths that are relevant to their lives and the lives of others, right? All of us have to try to discover our portion in the Torah, right? And that, again, as I say, this is the drasha of the Beis HaLevi. Okay, so now, though, I just want to end with a thought about Purim. And that is, we know, of course, that normally Yomim Tovim, part of what we do on the Yom Tov is the recitation of Hallel. Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos. We, of course, recite Hallel. Every Rosh Chodesh, we recite Hallel, although it's half Hallel, it's considered to be a minhag and the like. And there is, however, no Hallel that we recite on Purim. We don't recite, even though our lives were jeopardized, our lives were in danger. We do not recite Hallel on Purim. And the question is, why don't we? And you obviously cannot give the answer, well, Purim is a rabbinic holiday, it's not in the Torah. Well, keep in mind that Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah happened much later than Purim, 200 years after the Purim story. And we do say a full Hallel, all 8 days of Hanukkah, because God saved us from the threat of the Yevanim, and therefore we have to be Meshabeach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So why is there no Hallel on Purim? Again, I'll be sure you understand this. Purim is, of course, a biblical holiday. It's in Tanakh, but technically it is a rabbinical Yom Tov. It is not a Doraisa Yom Tov, because the only holidays that are Torah holidays are holidays in the 5 books of Moses, in the Torah. Any Yom Tov after the Jews received the Torah is halachically going to be a rabbinic Yom Tov. So even though it may sound incongruous that we describe Purim as a rabbinic festival, Purim halachically is a Rabbanan Chag, not a Doraisa Chag, because it is not part of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Okay? So Purim is Midrabanan, Chanukah is certainly Midrabanan, but Chanukah has Hallel, and Purim doesn't have Hallel. So why is there no Hallel on the holiday of Purim? So the Gemara in Maseches Megillah asks the question, why is there no Hallel on Purim? And it gives no fewer than 3 answers. Answer number 1 is, there is no Hallel on Purim because reading of the Megillah is the Hallel of Purim. In other words, there is Hallel on Purim, but the Hallel of Purim is Kriyat HaMegillah. We discuss how God saved us. That's answer number 1. I'll come back to that. Answer number 2, Ein Omrim Hallel al Nes Shebachutza La'aretz. We do not recite Hallel on miracles that occurred outside of the land of Israel. Now it's true, let me just remind you, the Purim story happened towards the end of the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, and a number of Jews have already returned. This is the time of Zerubbabel. There were some Jews who did return, but most of the Jews were in Chutz La'aretz. Most of the Jews of the 127 provinces of Achashverosh were in Chutz La'aretz. So a majority of the population that was in jeopardy were outside of the land of Israel, and we don't recite Hallel for redemptions that occur outside of the land of Israel. Now, I hope you're thinking of the obvious question about that. Well, wait a second here. What about the Hallel of Pesach? The Hallel of Pesach is over the Exodus from Egypt. All of that happened outside of Eretz Yisrael. So what do you mean you don't say Hallel on a Nes of Chutz La'aretz? Yetzias Mitzrayim itself is a Nes Shebachutz La'aretz. So the Gemara gives a technical answer, and that is, until the Jewish people came to Eretz Yisrael, we would celebrate every miracle, including those miracles outside of Eretz Yisrael. Once we came to Eretz Yisrael and were exiled, so we're not in a state of Geula, so we don't recite a Hallel on that. So the Hallel of Pesach is pre-Eretz Yisrael arrival. The holiday of Purim is post-Eretz Yisrael arrival with an exile. So on that we say, Ein Omrim Hallel al Nes Shebachutza La'aretz. That is answer number 2. And then the Gemara gives an answer number 3. And answer number 3 says, we only say Hallel when after the miracle we're out of hot water, like Chanukah. We were able to establish freedom from the Yevanim. Pesach, we're out of Mitzrayim. But in the case of Purim, we're still under the rule of Achashverosh. So yes, he got rid of Haman. But what's going to stop him the next day from just getting some other anti-Semitic person? In other words, the Jews are still in a state of vulnerability. We're still the servants of Achashverosh. We can't really say Hallel that we've been saved, because we've been saved today, and who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. In fact, I've always said that this might be the pshat. The Megillah has, at the end of the whole story of Purim and the establishment of the holiday of Purim, there's a very anticlimactic chapter 10, the very end of the Megillah, just a few verses. It's anticlimactic. The story is over, and Purim is a holiday, been established as a great holiday. LaYehudim ha'isa orev v'simcha. And then it just says, Achashverosh imposed a tax on the isles of the sea, and all of his power and strength, behold, you can look at them in the chronicles of the kings of Madai and Paras. And then there's a last verse about Mordechai. Even the last verse is a little negative. It says, Mordechai was great and respected, and he was admired by most of his brethren. So I'll say, most of his brethren liked him. Some members of the Sanhedrin said he was spending too much time on politics, and they lost a little respect for him. All right, so even that ends. So what's going on? It's kind of anticlimactic and even a little bit negative. And the answer is, yeah, we had this great miracle of Purim. But right after the miracle, you're back in your old regular life again. Unfortunately, to some degree, we're going through that now a little bit. When the war began, October 7, we were all shocked. We were all shell-shocked. We were all in a state of devastation. But as a result of that great, great tragedy of 1,200 people being massacred and the Chatufim and the hostages, there was tremendous unity. We did come together. We were one. We were determined that we would stand together and we would go ahead. What happens is, we're not out of this war yet. And B'ezras Hashem, we should be out soon. But at some point, it becomes just part of life. And unfortunately, some of the bonds of unity that were so strong and powerful, they get weak. Like an elastic band. You pull an elastic band, but then you let go. It just goes back to where it was. And that's what the Megillah is saying. You think Purim is such a big deal. Okay, Baruch Hashem. Life goes back. Achashverosh imposes his taxes. But this is the third reason. So again, just to summarize, the Gemara gives 3 different reasons why there is no Hallel on Purim. Reason number 1, Megillah is Hallel. Reason number 2, we don't recite Hallel on miracles that happen outside of Eretz Yisrael. Reason number 3, we don't recite Hallel if we are still in danger, even after the miracle. By the way, reason number 3, interestingly enough, is one of the non-ideological reasons why some do not recite Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut. The issue of Hallel on Israeli Independence Day is one of the great, I think people make it a much more divisive issue than it has to be, but this is one of the big issues. If any of you are planning ever to apply to be a rabbi in the United States, be forewarned that one of the interview questions you will be asked is, what is your position on Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut? And when you're sitting there as a candidate, you're wondering, what do they want me to say? What should I? It's kind of, I can go either way on it, but what do they want? Whatever it would be. And obviously that's bound up with your view of Zionism and your view of Medinas Yisrael. But some have argued there's actually a non-ideological reason not to say Hallel. And they say that Yom HaAtzmaut did not take us out of danger. Yom HaAtzmaut put us in a permanent state of vulnerability to attack. So based on the third answer of the Gemara, that we're still in a state of vulnerability, that would be a simple, it has nothing to do with Zionism, nothing to do with anything, but that would be a reason not to say Hallel. See, like the first 2 reasons, you would say Hallel, because they don't apply here. But the third reason might apply to the Yom HaAtzmaut situation. Okay, so we do have these 3 reasons for not saying Hallel. But I hope you can see that reason number 1 is different than 2 and 3. 2 and 3 give the reasons why you're patur from Hallel. Reason number 1 actually says you're chayav in Hallel, but Megillah is the fulfillment of Hallel. Of the 3 reasons, the Shulchan Aruch paskins like reason number 1. The Shulchan Aruch says we don't recite Hallel on Purim because Mikra Megillah is Hallel. Earlier than the Shulchan Aruch, the Meiri, one of the Rishonim, also paskins like this, and he says a very surprising halacha. The Meiri says, let's say you're stranded on a desert island, and it's Purim, very lonely Purim, and you don't have a Megillah, but you happen to have a siddur or a Tehillim. You know what the Meiri says? You are obligated to recite Hallel with a bracha, a full Hallel with a bracha on Purim. Because says the Meiri, the Gemara really says, like the first answer, you're obligated in Hallel. Elamai, reading Megillah is a substitute. So says the Meiri, if you're not going to read the Megillah as a substitute, you actually have to say Hallel. That's what the Meiri says. But the Mishnah Brura later says we don't follow the Meiri, and not only is Megillah a substitute for Hallel, but Megillah is the only way you can do Hallel. You can't do Hallel through Hallel. You can only do Hallel through Megillah. And therefore, if Nebuch, you don't have a Megillah, that's very bad, very sad, but you don't say Hallel. I mean, you can say Hallel without a bracha, like all Tehillim, but you don't say the Hallel with a bracha. So, the question is, what's the logic of that position? I mean, l'chayra, the Meiri seems to be correct. Because if the Gemara says, you're chayav in Hallel, but Megillah is the way you're Yotzei Hallel, why should a surrogate Hallel be better than Hallel? Right? Hallel should be better than something that takes the place of Hallel. So Rav Hutner, great Rosh Hashiva of Chaim Berlin, in his Pachad Yitzchak, these are his famous Mamorim, his discourses. Rav Hutner was an interesting, again, I could digress about this a lot too. Rav Hutner was a very interesting amalgamation of Hasidish Rebbe and Litvisher Rosh Hashiva. He was the most Hasidish of all of the non-Hasidic Rosh Yeshiva, and even the way he conducted his yeshiva, the way he conducted his tishin, even the tish, Mamorim, And in fact, it's interesting that back in the 1950s, before the Lubavitcher Rebbe was Rebbe, he and Rav Hutner had a private chavrusa learning Maharal together. That would have been an interesting chavrusa to watch. They used to learn together. They all had like a private life before they became so famous. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rav Menachem Mendel, who was not the Rebbe then, would learn every week with Rav Hutner. They would learn Maharal. It's interesting, Maharal, so that's kind of neutral territory. In other words, they didn't do Tanya, they didn't do a Chabad thing, B'dafka, they did Maharal. Maharal was, of course, the great-grandfather of the Balatanya, so in a sense, it's also Chabad, but it's pre-Chasidus, Lagamri. So Rav Hutner's Mamorim, Pachad Yitzchak, are really very, very interesting, very poetic, very difficult to understand. In fact, there was a professor of philosophy in St. Louis who actually showed, he was from person, that a lot of Rav Hutner's stuff showed that he was very familiar with all sorts of philosophical writings outside of traditional Judaism, which he never referred to. Like, this is from Aristotle, this is from Plato, this is from Schopenhauer, even more recent people and the like. Rav Hutner had a whole Mara Makomos that were not documented in the SEFER. They even told the story that a student once told him a chiddush on something. So Rav Hutner slapped him in the face and said, "You shouldn't be reading Heschel," whatever it is. That Rav Hutner knew it was from a controversial source that Rav Hutner was familiar with, but he said the student shouldn't be reading it. But anyway, that's just digression. But Rav Hutner's hesber is the following hesber. Rav Hutner says that Hallel must take the form of the miracle that it's commemorating. There are two types of miracles in life. There is what is called an open supernatural miracle that suspends the laws of nature. The prototype is, of course, Pesach, Yetzias Mitzrayim, the 10 Makos, Kriyas Yamsuf, totally above the laws of nature, an open and obvious revelation of God. So Rav Hutner says, a miracle that represents an open and obvious revelation of God must be commemorated by an open and obvious declaration of praise. A nes nigla, an open and revealed miracle, requires a hallel galuyah, an open hallel. Purim is a very, very different type of miracle. Purim is not the miracle of the supernatural. There is not a single event in the Megillah that is supernatural. Every single step viewed in isolation could just be part of the politics of the day. Achashverosh kills his queen. Well, that's how it worked in the ancient world. Didn't like the woman, you just killed her. Esther was chosen. Well, somebody had to be chosen. Mordechai happens to overhear an assassination plot that gives him the information to be on Achashverosh's good side. Right time, right place. The fact that Haman wants to destroy a nation, not knowing that this is the queen's nation. Wow, what a lucky turn of events. There is no miracle here. Except in hindsight, you see all the pieces come together. And by the way, it's over 9 years as well. It was a slow process. It wasn't like it happened in a day. You see how God operates in nature. Purim is called a hidden miracle. The word Esther is connected to Hester, concealment. Purim is the holiday of the Gullus, because Gullus is when God's presence is most concealed. So says Rav Hutner, if an open supernatural miracle requires an open and explicit praise of Hallel, a concealed miracle requires a concealed Hallel. Megillah is a concealed Hallel because the name of Hashem is not even mentioned in the Megillah. So this is why we don't follow the Meiri. The Meiri's argument is if you don't have a Megillah, you ought to recite Hallel. Rav Hutner says no. The Hallel of Megillah is the only type of Hallel you can use for Purim, because if a nes nigla requires Hallel Galuya, a nes nistar, a hidden miracle, requires Hallel nisteret. Right? This is a beautiful hesber. And the great importance of Purim is that a Jew has to know that even in times of concealment, even in times when the hand of God is not visible in an open, obvious way, He is behind the reality that we're living in, guiding us, helping us, protecting us. And a Jew has to learn, really every person in the world, not even only Jews, has to look at the world with the eyes of emunah, the eyes of faith. Because if you look to see Hashem's divine providence, you will find it. If you choose not to look, you will not see it. If you choose to look, you will always see it's there. And that is the great message of Purim. So have a good Shabbos, a good week, good Chodesh.
Yiboneh Reach,